Hello everybody and welcome to this recording of a presentation on effective work with adults who self-neglect and what we can learn from research and in England safeguarding adult reviews and obviously in Wales the Welsh equivalent. This presentation is being recorded as a contribution to Mid and West Wales Adult Safeguarding Week and the three webinars that I will facilitate during that week of the 16th of November. So I hope that you will find this recording useful, and I will amplify and elaborate on the slides and on this presentation during the three webinars which we have arranged for Adult Safeguarding Week in mid-November. So this presentation is about work with adults who self-neglect. We have just completed in England the first ever national analysis of safeguarding adult reviews. There were 231 reviews in the sample, and 104 of those, so around 45% of the reviews in the sample, contained references to self-neglect amongst the different types of abuse and neglect that can be reviewed. And I think that illustrates how challenging these cases can be, how complex they can be. And so this presentation and the three webinars that will follow in mid-November is designed to share with you the best evidence that we have about what might work with adults who self-neglect, and to enable you to reflect on the degree to which in your lived experience of work in Mid and West Wales you are able to get close to the evidence base about best practice, and if there are barriers to getting close to that evidence base, then hopefully this presentation and the webinars will enable you to identify clearly what those barriers are, and indeed to seek to address them through conversations in your own organisation and across the adult safeguarding partnerships of which you are a part. So what do we mean by self-neglect? Some individuals neglect their personal care, their health and well-being to such an extent that they endanger their own lives and sometimes the lives of others. Other people may collect items, materials, possessions, some valuable, some that may appear to us to have no value or meaning at all. And it's important to recognise that hoarding is now classified in its own right as a mental disorder, and that evidences the interface with mental health and mental health legislation. Some people may live in situations of squalor that again endanger their own lives or indeed the lives of others. And very often in these cases, people are very reluctant to engage in conversations and with support and services that are being offered. And all of that in an England context is captured in a definition that is contained in the statutory guidance that accompanies the Care Act 2014, which applies in England. So that's what we're talking about. And what the evidence base demonstrates is that effective practice requires what this slide calls whole system engagement. So in line with making safeguarding personal, clearly we need to know what research and safeguarding adult reviews and their Welsh equivalent recommend in terms of best practice with individuals who self-neglect. And much of that revolves around the importance of relationships. However, in order to practice in that way, the legal and ethical framework needs to support your endeavours. Your organisations need to support you through supervision, peer support, management oversight, training. And the multi-agency frameworks, both strategic partnerships, but also operational collaboration, also needs to support the work that you are attempting to do with adults who self-neglect. So, referring back to my comment about enablers and barriers in Mid and West Wales, to what degree do you think you are working in a system that is aligned in the way that I have described? Or are there parts of this complete system that are out of alignment and therefore frustrating your best efforts? For example, you may be hoping to engage other practitioners in supporting your efforts to work with an adult who self-neglects and or hoards. Are you getting the cooperation that you think would help you to make progress with a particular case? What we find from case reviews, both those done in Wales and those done in England, is that despite the evidence about best practice, despite the evidence of what is most likely to work in cases of self-neglect, we find shortcomings across the system. In other words, we find a lack of alignment between different parts of the adult safeguarding system. We find work on uncoordinated parallel lines. In other words, agencies pulling in different directions and not working together. We find failures of communication and information sharing, and a lack of strategic leadership and indeed operational leadership across the different agencies involved, and a reluctance by practitioners to escalate their concerns, particularly when collaboration and cooperation from other services is missing. Some reviews highlight a failure to think family. Not all people who self-neglect and hoard live alone. Sometimes they live with other adults, sometimes there are children involved, and therefore children's services involved alongside adult services. In those cases, it is very important to think family and to address the needs within the whole family system. And when children's services and adult services are fragmented and indeed structured as two separate entities, the danger, the risk there is that the two agencies fail to work effectively together to meet the needs of the whole family. We find reviews identifying that practitioners are uncertain or unaware of legal options that might exist, or reluctant to seek the intervention, for example, of the Court of Protection. We find shortcomings in assessments across the piece, assessments of mental capacity, mental health, care and support needs, and risk. And we find a failure to use multi-agency meetings and safeguarding inquiries in an effort to promote interagency cooperation and to agree a risk mitigation plan. So as you look at that slide, you might reflect on the degree to which any or all of those issues have arisen in your lived experience of work, but maybe you have some good stories to tell about cooperation across the adult safeguarding system. And here is the first of a number of cases that highlight some of the points that I have made and will make. So you can find this case on the East Sussex Safeguarding Adult Board website, a case of Mr. A. And here you can see a significant medical and mental health history. The involvement of a former work colleague of Mr. A, who held a lasting power of attorney, and an individual who was refusing care and treatment in the nursing home in which he was placed. And this case illustrates much of what I have already said about shortcomings across the whole system. So there were shortcomings in relation to mental capacity assessments that either were not done or were not sufficiently robust. There were shortcomings in relation to bringing all of the agencies together to coordinate a plan of work with Mr. A. There was uncertainty about the interface between the legal rules relating to mental capacity and mental health. And there was poor recording, particularly in relation to deprivation of liberty safeguards, which were used in part of the case, but then allowed to lapse, and the failure to complete a renewal of the safeguards was not identified by any of the agencies involved in Mr. A's case. So it is a case that highlights what can go wrong in a number of areas in a case involving self-neglect. What then follows, and what we will have an opportunity to explore in detail in Adult Safeguarding Week in Mid and West Wales, is our 4 slides that capture the evidence base. These slides are derived from research and from safeguarding adult reviews in England and practice reviews in Wales. So in terms of direct work with individuals, here you have some of the key components of the evidence base. The importance of professional curiosity, the importance of finding out about a person's history and their life journey and how it is that they come to be in the situation in which you find them. A person-centered approach that recognises the need to take time to build relationships and trust. The importance of thorough assessments, particularly of mental capacity, but also of risk, care and support needs, and mental health. Not forgetting the use of advocacy, both care and support advocacy, mental health advocacy, mental capacity advocacy, and where carers are involved, recognising the duty to offer carer assessments, but also to explore family dynamics because they can be a significant component of some self-neglect cases. In terms of the team around the person, recognizing and emphasizing again the importance of whole system alignment, the importance of legal literacy, knowing and considering available law, the importance of safeguarding literacy, and particularly how to refer safeguarding concerns, the importance of services working together, sharing assessments, information, and planning, the importance of information sharing, and there's a link there to legal literacy and particularly the Data Protection Act 2018, and when it permits the sharing of information even without consent. So the team around the adult, there is an evidence base about what best practice looks like there. And then the importance of each organisation supporting its contribution through the team around the person. The cases are complex. They involve considerable risk very often. They can be stressful. They can be demanding. And so support that includes supervision and managerial oversight in a culture that recognises that it is vital when people feel uncertain or fearful that they are able to express that uncertainty, that anxiety, in the knowledge that they will be supported rather than criticised. A culture that recognises the importance of challenge, that recognises the importance of escalation of concerns. Contributions that individual organisations can make to support their practitioners and operational managers within a multi-agency context to work effectively with people who self-neglect. And then lastly, the contribution of safeguarding adult boards, a contribution through multi-agency training, a contribution through conducting single and multi-agency audits for the purpose of assurance that adult safeguarding is working effectively, in your case in Mid and West Wales, and where necessary, conducting practice reviews in Wales, safeguarding adult reviews in England, and ensuring that lessons from those reviews are disseminated widely across the adult safeguarding partnerships where you are working. So we have an evidence base. That is the good news. We do actually know what is most likely to work in these types of cases. Nonetheless, there are real challenges in working with adults who self-neglect and hoard. And much of the rest of this presentation revolves around 6 key challenges. And it is these challenges that I hope we will have an opportunity to explore together in Adult Safeguarding Week in November in Mid and West Wales. So I will speak to some but not all of the slides in this presentation, but I will return to these slides in the webinars that we have in Adult Safeguarding Week. So the first challenge is what is going on. There's no one explanation for why people self-neglect or hoard. And it can be a complex interplay of a whole range of factors. But one of the points I would really wish to stress here is that in any assessment that you are conducting or are a part of, I would encourage you really to explore whether somebody is unwilling to address the risks that you perceive in the self-neglect that you encounter, and or whether a person is unable. In other words, do not rush to judgment here, but to really tease out the degree to which there is unwillingness and or inability. And as part of that, to explore the person's life journey, how it is that they have ended up in the situation in which you encounter them today. In other words, what is the meaning of the self-neglect that you encounter? And as part of that exploration, you will then be able to identify which other practitioners from which other professional backgrounds you need to engage to construct a bespoke team around this person, informed very much by your understanding of the journey to today that the individual has experienced. And we will have an opportunity in the webinars to explore a little more what people who engaged in research with us about self-neglect told us about their lived experience, their journeys. And here you can see 3 themes that we identified from the rich stories and accounts that service users gave us. And here are 3 more. And the point I would make perhaps here and invite you to reflect on ahead of what we might discuss in the webinars to follow in November is the influence of the past. You cannot understand a person in the here and now without understanding the there and then, the journey that they have been through. If you were working with me, and I'm not at the moment at any rate a person who self-neglects and hoards, but if you were working with me in the here and now, you would need to understand to a greater or lesser extent my life journey across 68 years in order to understand how I might perceive the world now, and indeed the options open to me. So when you hear people talk about adverse childhood experiences, when you hear people talking about a trauma-informed approach, it is really important to recognize that there are significant contributions that can be made from those understandings in relation to work with people who self-neglect and hoard. The second challenge revolves around ethics. It revolves around a recognition in law that adults are autonomous and self-determining unless you can demonstrate that it would be lawful in some way to qualify, to limit or restrict the autonomy and self-determination that a person is exercising. And we will have an opportunity in the webinars in Adult Safeguarding Week to explore this, this tension, this ethical dilemma in greater detail, particularly with adults whom you have assessed as having capacity to take a particular decision. Clearly there is an imperative to respect their autonomy and their self-determination, but nonetheless the decision that they are taking may place them at considerable risk and prompt in you concerns about whether to exercise in some way a duty of care and a duty to protect. I am sure that you have encountered situations that exemplify that particular dilemma. When faced with that particular dilemma, as evidenced in the quotes here, which are quotes from people who participated in the research about self-neglect and hoarding, it's really important to tease out the degree to which people may be exercising choice, to tease out whether, in fact, they perceive that they have any kind of choice at all. In other words, not to rush to easy judgments about, well, the person is making a lifestyle choice, well, they have a right to make unwise decisions, but to really tease out the options that people perceive that they have or don't have. And that requires conversation. It requires reflection. It requires analysis, ideally with the person or the people that you are working with. And this slide invites you to reflect on when actually autonomy may not be that simple, but equally to reflect on when protection might actually not be that simple either. And what the research and the reviews would encourage is professional curiosity, concerned questioning, respectful challenge. This was summed up for me by one person who had engaged in behaviours that we would identify as self-neglect. And when I asked him what had enabled him to begin to make changes in his life, he replied it was the social worker who kept on asking me carefrontational questions. And it's that phrase, carefrontational questions, that really captures the essence of what best practice is when you are faced with a dilemma between autonomy and self-determination on the one hand, and a duty of care and a duty to protect on the other. And what service users who had experience of self-neglect and hoarding and living in squalor told us in the research that we have done, and indeed it emerges from Safeguarding Adult Reviews in England loud and clear, is the importance of a relational approach. In other words, as the slide says, ethical action situated within a relationship. And here, of course, there is another component of whole system alignment. The organisations that employ you need to be giving you the permission to spend the time required to build up this relational approach. And what you can see is the importance of humanity, us expressing our humanity with the people that we are working with. These again are direct quotes from people who had experience of self-neglect. The third challenge revolves around mental capacity, and I've no doubt in the webinars to come in November we will spend some time focusing on the challenges of assessing mental capacity with at least some adults who self-neglect, where self-neglect can include, for example, substance misuse, and how that complicates assessments that you may be attempting to complete. And you'll see that one of these 4 boxes has a question mark in. And perhaps it is in those cases where the ethical dilemma that I have just been talking about emerges most significantly, namely when it appears that somebody has mental capacity to take a particular decision, but is nonetheless engaging in self-neglect and running considerable risks for their own lives and or the lives of others. So a reminder about the Mental Capacity Act 2005 and the importance of remembering that capacity is decision specific and time specific, but the importance too of reminding ourselves of precisely what the Act says and does not say. So I often hear practitioners talking about whether somebody can use and weigh, when in fact the Act talks about use or weigh. I hear people talking about people having a right to make unwise decisions. But if you read carefully the 5 principles that are contained within mental capacity legislation, the principles are framed a little differently from what sometimes I and maybe we hear practitioners talking about. So the importance of accurately understanding what the Act says and does not say. What I would want to emphasize ahead of the conversations that we will have in the webinars to follow is the importance of encouraging all of us to think about executive functioning. And here I think we have a lot to learn from occupational therapists who, as part of their training, are taught to conduct functional assessments. And what that involves is encouraging someone to demonstrate how they will enact the decision that is the focus of an assessment. For example, my father, who is 92, would, if you were talking about his situation with him, tell you that he can cook, that he can make cups of tea, that he can, with some difficulty, manage all of the activities of daily living. If, however, you were to watch him, then you would get a much more nuanced understanding of what he can and cannot do, and whether what he says is actually reflected in what he does. And that's the importance of factoring in executive functioning or executive capacity. And if you talk with occupational therapists, I'm sure that that is what they would reference, functional assessments. Recognise too that particularly with people who engage in prolonged substance misuse, that can profoundly affect mind and brain. But the impact of that impairment of mind or brain may not always be apparent in terms of what people say, but it may be more apparent in terms of what people do. And if you are unsure about whether there is, for example, frontal lobe damage as a result of prolonged exposure to adverse experiences and or substance misuse, it is really important to access mental capacity specialists in the particular area that you are concerned about. And so this slide captures what I have been attempting to articulate in this presentation. The importance of a nuanced understanding when you are doing mental capacity assessments. And here is another case that you can find, this time on the Wandsworth Safeguarding Adult Board website, where a functional mental capacity assessment, whether somebody then could use or weigh the information that you might have been feeding back to her when you asked her to demonstrate how she would keep herself safe, should have been a core ingredient of capacity assessments in that particular case. The fourth of the 6 challenges is legal literacy. Being aware of both the legal rules that are there in negotiated work that you may do with an individual, and they are, as I look at the screen, more to the left, starting with the scales that are meant to represent the Human Rights Act, moving across towards more coercive legislation as you reach across towards the right-hand end of the slide. The ability, for example, to intervene to protect animals, the use of antisocial behaviour legislation, and indeed in Wales, but not in England, an adult safeguarding power of entry. It may not be necessary for all practitioners to have a detailed understanding of all of these legal rules, but it is essential that all practitioners recognise that there are a range of legal rules that may have a contribution to make when seeking to support adults who self-neglect. So it's important to have a sound knowledge of the legal rules, or at least to be aware that there are particular legal rules that may have a contribution to make. And that includes human rights and equality legislation alongside adult social care legislation, and indeed mental health, mental capacity and other areas of our law. And it is important to bring people together to discuss the potential contributions that different areas of the legal rules may be able to make to resolving the situation that you're working with. It's important to recognise that in addition to the legal rules captured in Acts of Parliament and indeed enactments of the Welsh Assembly, it is important also to recognise the area of administrative law, which is essentially the area of law that deals with the standards that those exercising lawful authority should demonstrate in all of the decisions that they take. And those standards are reflected on the slide there. And when reaching decisions, both as an individual practitioner, but also in these cases in a multi-agency context, it is important to record what decisions you took, what options you considered before deciding what action to take, and what your justification in law and in professional practice is for the decisions that you have ultimately decided to take. And that's about producing a map, if you like, an account that you can stand by and articulate clearly if any of the decisions that you take are ultimately challenged in some way. And here is a case that demonstrates the importance of legal literacy. This is on the Kent and Medway Safeguarding Adult Board website. This is a case that demonstrates that in England we do not have an adult safeguarding power of entry, unlike Wales and Scotland, but there are professions, services that do have powers of entry, and it is important to recognise when those powers of entry may or may not be used. But it is also a case that demonstrates the importance of thinking family, for example, and the importance of sharing information, obtaining information from people who may have it, including family members and neighbours, and the importance of working in a multi-agency context. The fifth challenge is the organisational context. As I've highlighted at least once in this presentation, organisations singly and collectively need to be empowering frontline practitioners and managers to get as close as possible to the evidence base of best practice. So we need thresholds and eligibility criteria that can, when necessary, be flexible and be flexed in order to address the needs that you encounter. You will need time to build relationships, to build trust, to find a way into helping and supporting people who self-neglect. So being time limited is unhelpful in cases of self-neglect. So is the organisational context in which you are working enabling or a barrier? And that slide illustrates the point a little more, and we will have an opportunity to reflect more on the organisational context in the webinars to follow. So the organisational environment needs to be supportive in the way that I have outlined, and I have stressed more than once the importance of supervision and the importance of managerial oversight and an organisational culture that encourages you both to escalate concerns, but also to highlight where you are uncertain and or anxious about what is the best approach to take. And then lastly, we need robust interagency working from the Safeguarding Adult Board downwards or across into the strategic relationships between health, housing, social care, emergency services, social landlords, and so forth, with clear pathways for referrals, for accessing support, for bringing organisations together to share information and to seek to agree a risk management plan. We need robust interagency working. And again, you can reflect on the degree to which you experience that in your daily work. So in summary, the best evidence that we have is about being, knowing, and doing in a context of relationships with people who self-neglect and hoard, and relationships between practitioners and across services. Where in the context of those relationships, you are in an ideal world looking to negotiate a way forward, to agree in partnership with the people that you are working with, the best way to move forward. But recognizing that in some circumstances, the level of risk will be such that an intervention has to be imposed, and to be really clear with people when you feel you are approaching just that scenario. And a final pen picture, a final safeguarding adult review. This is about Andy. You can find Andy's story and review on the Salford Safeguarding Adult Board website. Here was somebody who had a considerable number of challenges in his adult life, and indeed a range of adverse experiences that were really impacting on his ability to respond to the support that was being offered, particularly by healthcare practitioners in his case. And with his family members saying to me after he passed away that he was not intentionally self-neglecting. Going back to what I said earlier about the importance in assessments of differentiating between whether someone is unwilling and or unable, the family were pointing out to me that he was unable on many occasions to respond to the support that was being offered to him, and yet services were assuming that in fact he was unwilling. This slide captures some of the themes that emerged from the analysis of Andy's case, and I would strongly encourage you to read this particular Safeguarding Adult review, because it demonstrates the importance of recognizing what best practice entails and doing our very best to get as close as possible to it. So this slide summarizes the evidence in terms of approaches by practitioners. This slide summarizes the findings in relation to organizational approaches. These two slides, in a sense, bring me full circle back to the evidence base with which I began at the outset of this presentation. So very finally, for those of you who wish to follow up anything that I have said today and the contents of the slides, there are some research reports that are available and indeed some journal articles that I hope you might be able to access. But if you can't and you are particularly interested in them, then you can contact me by email, and my address is at the end of the slides. And if you are attending the webinars, you will have a handout of the slides so that you can retain my email address in case you need it going forward. Finally, from me, a sincere appreciation and thanks for the contributions that you are making to adult safeguarding in general, and to work with adults who self-neglect and hoard in particular. May the force be with you, and thank you for listening. Okay, Stuart.